They say every generation thinks it is different, but difference is rarely about fashion, music, or rebellion. It is about survival. It is about adaptation. The 1970s are often remembered as a decade of disco lights, political distrust, cultural experimentation, and restless youth. A time of bell-bottom jeans and loud guitars. A time when young people were said to be free. But freedom is a complicated word. What happens to a generation that grows up after the shockwaves of war, during economic instability, amid social revolutions and shifting moral codes? What happens when trust in authority quietly erodes, and young minds learn to rely on themselves instead? Was it rebellion, or self-protection? Was it expression, or a search for identity in a world that felt unstable? Beneath the surface of 1970s youth culture lived something deeper: anxiety, independence, fragmentation, resilience. In this reflection, the psychology behind that era will be explored, not the trends, not the nostalgia, but the emotional blueprint that shaped an entire generation. Let's begin. They were rebellious. That is the sentence history often repeats. Young people in the 1970s protested. They questioned authority. They rejected traditional dress codes, family expectations, political narratives. They experimented with music, ideology, relationships, even consciousness itself. But rebellion is rarely random. In developmental psychology, adolescence and early adulthood are defined by a central crisis: identity versus role confusion. Erik Erikson described this stage as a psychological crossroads. The young person asks, "Who am I? Where do I belong? What do I believe?" Now imagine asking those questions in a decade marked by cultural upheaval. The Vietnam War had left emotional scars across families. The Watergate scandal eroded faith in leadership. Economic instability unsettled the promise of predictable futures. Divorce rates were rising. Gender roles were shifting. The script that previous generations had followed no longer felt reliable. When the structure around you feels unstable, identity becomes urgent. So the long hair, the denim jackets, the underground music, the protest signs, were these acts of defiance, or were they psychological anchors? Youth culture in the 1970s was not simply rejecting the old world. It was searching for coherence in a world that felt fractured. Identity formation intensifies when societal narratives weaken. If institutions cannot be trusted, the self must become the compass. This is not chaos. This is adaptation. Collective rebellion often masks collective uncertainty. When millions of young people move in the same direction, toward new values, new symbols, new language, it creates the illusion of confidence. But beneath that unity, there is often confusion. Who can be trusted? What future is secure? Which rules still matter? Rebellion can be a loud expression of a quiet fear, the fear of becoming lost in someone else's expectations. In many ways, the 1970s youth were not fighting authority for the sake of destruction. They were negotiating psychological separation, individuation. The process of becoming distinct from parental and societal identity was amplified by historical instability. And when individuation is intensified, expression becomes louder. Music festivals became rituals of belonging. Fashion became a visible declaration of autonomy. Political activism became a pathway to moral clarity. These were not only cultural trends, they were developmental necessities, because when external structures weaken, the young mind does not collapse. It compensates. It experiments. It constructs identity through contrast. If the old system says obedience, the new identity says autonomy. If tradition says silence, the new voice says expression. Not because rebellion is glamorous, but because confusion is intolerable. The illusion was that the decade produced reckless youth. The deeper truth is that it produced young people urgently building psychological stability in an unstable world. And sometimes, building requires dismantling first. They say you should respect authority. But respect is built on trust, and trust once fractured, rarely returns unchanged. For many young people coming of age in the 1970s, authority did not feel steady. Governments had misled their citizens. The Vietnam War had unfolded on television screens, bringing distant violence into living rooms. The Watergate scandal revealed corruption at the highest level of leadership. Economic recession and inflation quietly destabilized households. Promises felt thinner. In psychology, attachment theory explains how early relationships shape expectations about safety and reliability. When caregivers are consistent, trust forms. When caregivers are unpredictable, hypervigilance grows. Now imagine a parallel at the societal level. Institutions function like collective caregivers. Governments, schools, media, churches, they provide structure, predictability, moral guidance. When these systems appear stable, young people internalize a sense of order, but when they falter publicly, something subtle shifts. The message becomes do not rely too much. Sociologists refer to this as institutional distrust, a weakening belief that systems will act in the public's best interest. For the youth of the 1970s, distrust was not theoretical, it was visible, televised, discussed at dinner tables, and when trust collapses, autonomy intensifies. If leaders can deceive, then questioning becomes survival. If authority can fail, then skepticism becomes wisdom. What looked like defiance was often protective cognition, a psychological recalibration, an internal voice whispering, verify, question, stay alert. This did not mean young people stopped caring. In fact, many became more politically engaged, but engagement carried a sharper edge, a tone of caution, a reluctance to surrender belief blindly. Attachment research shows that inconsistent caregiving can produce anxious or avoidant relational styles. At a societal scale, inconsistency can produce generational guardedness, trust, but slowly, commit, but cautiously, hope, but with backup plans. The 1970s youth learned to lean less on institutions and more on peers. Community shifted horizontally, rather than vertically. Authority moved from official structures to shared experience. Music became truth, subcultures became refuge, friendships became reliability. When systems disappoint, belonging reorganizes itself. This generation did not simply reject authority, they renegotiated their relationship with it. They internalized a quieter rule, believe actions not promises, and that psychological imprint does not fade easily. It lingers into adulthood, into parenting styles, into workplace dynamics, into civic engagement. Because when trust collapses during formative years, the nervous system remembers, it becomes careful, observant, slow to surrender control, not because of cynicism, but because of experience. And so beneath the visible boldness of youth culture in the 1970s lived a quieter adaptation. A generation learning how to stand on its own when the ground beneath it felt unreliable. They were obsessed with freedom. That is how the decade is often remembered. Freedom of speech, freedom of love, freedom of lifestyle, freedom from expectations. But freedom is rarely born in comfort. It often grows in response to constraint. In psychology, self-determination theory proposes that human beings are driven by three core needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. When these needs are satisfied, well-being increases. When they are threatened, motivation intensifies. The 1970s threatened predictability. Economic instability weakened the promise of stable careers. Political betrayal weakened trust in leadership. Traditional gender roles began to shift, unsettling long-held norms. The blueprint that once guided adulthood no longer felt guaranteed. And when the future becomes uncertain, autonomy becomes essential. If systems cannot guarantee safety, the self must. Radical individualism, the strong emphasis on personal identity and choice, did not arise from selfishness alone. It arose from psychological recalibration. A generation quietly concluded, if the structure is unstable, I must become my own structure. This is where fashion transforms into identity language, where music becomes worldview, where lifestyle choices become statements of self-governance. The phrase "do your own thing" was not casual, it was adaptive. Research on locus of control reveals that individuals who feel powerless in external systems often shift inward, strengthening their internal sense of agency. Control may not exist politically or economically, but it can exist personally. So self-expression becomes stability. Choosing how to dress, whom to love, what to believe. These choices become micro-anchors in a sea of unpredictability. But individualism carries tension. The more one relies on the self, the less one depends on collective authority. And while this strengthens independence, it can quietly weaken trust. Autonomy empowers, but it also isolates. Was the radical self-expression of the 1970s liberation, or was it armor? Perhaps both. Because when belonging feels fragile, and institutions feel unreliable, identity becomes sacred territory. It must be protected, defined, asserted. The counterculture movements of the decade, whether artistic, political or communal, were not only protests, they were attempts to build alternative systems, new value hierarchies, new social contracts. If the old world felt compromised, a new one could be imagined. An imagination is psychologically powerful. It restores perceived control. It reduces helplessness. It creates a sense of authorship over one's narrative. Yet beneath the glow of autonomy lived a quiet pressure. If you are your own structure, you must hold yourself together. That weight can be empowering. It can also be exhausting. The rise of radical individualism in the 1970s was not simply cultural fashion. It was a psychological strategy, one that shaped how this generation would later approach careers, relationships, parenting, and risk. Self-reliance became identity, independence became virtue, control became safety, and the echoes of that shift still ripple forward. They didn't seem to care. That was another quiet accusation. A generation described as laid back, unbothered, casual about serious things, cloaked in irony, fluent in sarcasm. But indifference is often misunderstood. In psychology, defense mechanisms develop not to deceive others, but to preserve the self. When environments feel unpredictable, the nervous system searches for safety, and one powerful form of safety is emotional distance. If you do not invest too deeply, you cannot be devastated too easily. The 1970s unfolded under visible uncertainty. War trauma lingered in families. Economic pressures tightened slowly. Divorce rates rose. Trust in authority thinned. Cultural norms shifted rapidly. Rapid change destabilizes emotional predictability. And when predictability weakens, people adapt by lowering emotional exposure. Sarcasm becomes shield. Irony becomes insulation. Nonchalance becomes armor. Research on emotional suppression suggests that individuals who experience chronic stress often minimize outward displays of vulnerability, not because they lack emotion, but because expression feels risky. If institutions can fail, perhaps relationships can too. If promises can break publicly, perhaps they can break privately. Better to stay measured. Better to stay composed. Youth culture in the 1970s cultivated a certain coolness, a relaxed posture, a refusal to appear overly invested. This demeanor was often interpreted as apathy, but apathy is not always absence. Sometimes it is conservation. Emotional regulation theory explains that when stresses are prolonged, people may shift toward controlled emotional expression. High reactivity becomes costly. So the system learns moderation. But moderation can blur into detachment. Did this generation feel less, or did they simply reveal less? Emotional restraint can create stability in unstable times. It reduces vulnerability to disappointment. It strengthens perceived self-sufficiency, yet there is tension here. Suppressed emotion does not disappear. It settles. It moves inward. It becomes sediment at the bottom of the river. Outward calm. Inward complexity. Some youth found release in music, lyrics that carried unspoken frustration. Others found it in art. Experimentation. Altered states of consciousness. Expression was present, but often mediated through symbol rather than direct confession. Because direct confession requires trust, and trust had already been shaken. Emotional detachment, then, was not emptiness. It was pacing, a careful rationing of vulnerability. The decade's visible looseness masked invisible vigilance. And when a generation learns to protect itself this way, the pattern lingers. It shapes adult intimacy. It shapes communication. It shapes how deeply one allows oneself to depend on others. The illusion was indifference. The reality was adaptation. And adaptation always leaves an imprint. They rejected society. But human beings cannot survive without belonging. When traditional institutions begin to feel unreliable, the need for connection does not disappear, it intensifies. Belongingness theory suggests that the need to form stable, meaningful relationships is as fundamental as hunger. Without it, anxiety rises. Without it, identity destabilizes. The 1970s were not only an era of individualism, they were also an era of tribes. Music scenes became emotional homes. Political movements became moral families. Communes became experimental sanctuaries. Subcultures became shared languages. If mainstream society felt fractured, alternative communities offered coherence. Social identity theory explains that people derive part of their self-concept from group membership. When larger systems lose credibility, smaller groups become powerful psychological anchors. A denim jacket with a band patch was not decoration. It was affiliation. A protest chant was not noise. It was solidarity. A shared ideology was not fashion. It was identity reinforcement. The human nervous system relaxes in belonging. It finds rhythm in shared belief. It stabilizes when mirrored by others. And so youth culture in the 1970s did not simply rebel alone, it gathered. But these communities were not random. They were often built around shared skepticism, shared longing, shared desire for authenticity. If authority felt distant, peers felt immediate. If institutions felt abstract, community felt tangible. In uncertain environments, horizontal bonds often strengthen as vertical trust weakens. This shift carries psychological consequences. Peer validation becomes central. Group norms become powerful. Acceptance within subculture can feel safer than acceptance from broader society. Yet even belonging has layers. Some joined countercultures to feel understood. Some to feel protected. Some to feel significant in a world that seemed unstable. Belonging can soothe anxiety. It can also amplify group identity. The more fragmented the larger society feels, the tighter the smaller group may cling to its values. This dynamic was visible in the decade's polarization. Ideological, musical, cultural. Identity was not only personal, it was communal. But beneath every collective movement, lived an individual longing to not feel alone in uncertainty. Community offered what institutions could not. Emotional immediacy. It said, you are not imagining the instability. You are not the only one questioning. You are not alone in your doubt. And that reassurance is powerful. Because when trust collapses at the top, belonging rebuilds at the edges. The youth of the 1970s were not isolated wanderers. They were builders of parallel worlds, small ecosystems of meaning. In those spaces, identity could solidify. Emotion could be shared indirectly. Skepticism could feel normal. And the imprint of those communal bonds would follow them into adulthood, shaping how they seek friendships, workplaces, partnerships. Because once belonging is rebuilt from the ground up, it is never taken lightly again. They had more freedom than ever before. That is the nostalgic version. Less rigid rules, more open lifestyles, more visible self-expression. But freedom does not cancel fear. The 1970s carried economic turbulence, inflation rising, oil crises disrupting stability, unemployment creeping into households. For young people planning their futures, the path ahead did not look as solid as it once had for their parents, and uncertainty activates the nervous system. Chronic uncertainty is different from acute crisis. It is quieter. It hums in the background. It does not scream. It lingers. Psychologists describe this as low-grade prolonged stress, a state where the future feels unpredictable, but not immediately catastrophic. In such environments, the body adapts subtly, hyper-awareness increases, planning becomes cautious, optimism becomes measured. You may not panic, but you prepare. For 1970s youth, adulthood no longer promised automatic stability. The traditional milestones, secure job, stable marriage, predictable retirement, began to feel less guaranteed. And when guarantees weaken, control becomes personal. Freedom expanded socially, but economically and politically, security felt fragile. This creates a paradox: outward liberation paired with inward vigilance. Uncertainty theory explains that humans crave predictability. When predictability declines, cognitive load increases. The mind scans for patterns. It anticipates risk. Some respond by embracing spontaneity, leaning into the unpredictability. Others respond by strengthening independence, reducing reliance on unstable systems. Both are coping. But beneath the experimentation and cultural exploration lived a subtle question. What if the future does not hold steady? This quiet anxiety influenced life decisions. Career choices became pragmatic. Financial habits became cautious. Relationships sometimes carried guarded undertones. When the environment teaches you that stability can shift, you internalize flexibility. Adaptability becomes survival. Yet chronic low-level stress has long-term effects. It can harden resilience, but it can also entrench vigilance. A generation shaped by background instability may appear self-reliant, but that self-reliance often grows from learned unpredictability. Freedom, then, was not weightless. It came with responsibility. If institutions are unstable and markets fluctuate, the individual must navigate carefully. Personal choices carry more weight when external systems feel unreliable. The 1970s youth learned to read the room, to read the economy, to read political currents, not loudly, but persistently. And that quiet scanning, that subtle readiness, became embedded. The illusion was carefree liberation. The deeper layer was calibrated caution. Because when freedom exists alongside fragility, the nervous system never fully relaxes. It adapts, and adaptation, over time, becomes personality. Every generation leaves behind artifacts, photographs, music, fashion, political slogans. But the deepest legacy is invisible. It lives in nervous systems, in habits of thought, in subtle reflexes around trust and control. The youth who came of age in the 1970s did not simply grow older. They carried forward the adaptations they had built in uncertainty. Independence became instinctive. Skepticism became baseline. Emotional restraint became familiar. When trust fractures during formative years, it rarely returns to naive optimism. Instead, it reforms as measured trust. Conditional trust. Trust earned slowly. Research on generational imprinting suggests that socio-political environments during adolescence and early adulthood significantly influence long-term attitudes. These are sensitive years. The brain is still organizing its expectations about the world. If instability marks those years, resilience often follows. But so does caution. Many adults shaped by the 1970s became self-reliant parents. They encouraged autonomy. They valued critical thinking. They were less likely to accept authority without question. Yet beneath that strength sometimes lived difficulty with vulnerability. Because emotional detachment, once protective, can become habitual, the communal bonds of youth subcultures translated into strong friendships and loyalty. But institutional skepticism remained. Trust systems changed. Some found success in entrepreneurial paths, drawn to self-determination. Others maintained a careful distance from systems they did not fully believe in. The psychological patterns were not dramatic. They were subtle, like sediment settling into a riverbed. a preference for independence, a tolerance for ambiguity, a resistance to blind faith. These traits are not flaws. They are adaptations. But adaptations always have dual edges. Independence can empower and isolate. Skepticism can protect and distance. Resilience can strengthen and harden. The 1970s youth culture was not simply a moment in history. It was a psychological turning point, a recalibration of how young minds related to authority, identity, community, and risk. And that recalibration did not disappear with the decade. It echoes in workplaces, in family conversations, in political engagement, in the way some people quietly say, "I'll handle it myself." The legacy of that era is not noise. It is posture, a stance toward the world that says, "I have seen instability. I can stand on my own." And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath the nostalgia. The music fades, the fashion changes, but the nervous system remembers. If parts of this reflection felt familiar, if something quiet inside you recognized the tension between freedom and vigilance, you are not alone. Generations are shaped by more than trends. They are shaped by uncertainty, by adaptation, by invisible recalibrations of trust and identity. Nothing about that is weakness. It is human. If you'd like to stay connected, this space remains open. A place where the hidden layers of the human heart and mind are explored gently, without judgment. And if you feel comfortable sharing your thoughts, you may leave them below. Sometimes one reflection helps someone else feel less alone.